Okay, without further ado, let's get into the third and final presentation for tree keepers. We're going to go over tree maintenance, how to properly care for your street tree. Okay, so as you guys know, Crystal and I run volunteer-based tree planting programs, both in North Jersey and South Jersey. And so when we reach out to residents and we ask them to, if they want a tree, it's completely free for our residents. However, we do ask the resident to care and maintain that tree. And this is the result, right? These are trees that were adopted by residents. They agreed to have one planted in front of their home. And you can see that residents take onus of their trees. They're pruning them, they're caring for them. And you can see that these trees are well maintained and very healthy. Our goal at the Tree Foundation is beautiful street trees. We want trees. We know the environmental benefits of trees. We talked about that last week. And so we know that when we have street trees, we have healthy, beautiful communities that, can absorb runoff, clean the air, and shade and beautify the homes. And over 18 years since our first UARP tree planting, we have planted hundreds and thousands of trees, both in North and South Jersey. And the result is clear, right? Our beautiful, well-maintained street trees. This is what we don't want. These are not well-maintained street trees. And we'll talk about this again, but you can see the suckers, right? They should be taken off. The weeds, a gator bag that has been left on, for quite some time, probably going into the tree. We don't want to see this. We want our trees to be cared for. They can be attractive and beautiful when they're well-maintained. And with just a little bit of effort, these trees can look stunning. So we're going to go over a little bit about what Crystal and I look for when we're planning a volunteer-based tree planting. We're also going to talk about how to properly plant a tree, and we're going to talk about how to care for them after the planting. Our motto at the Tree Foundation is planting the right tree, the right place, in the right way. So making sure that before the tree is planted, it's the appropriate tree for that space, making sure that we're planting in the right location, and making sure that tree is properly planted the first time. So I'm going to use Camden as an example because that's the area that I manage. When I'm in Camden, putting together a tree planting project, there are things that I want to look out for. So I'll be on a city block. First thing I'm going to do is look up. I want to make sure where the overhead wires are located and what side of the street are they on. Usually they're on one side of the street or the other, and take note of that. Whatever side of the street has the wires, I'm only going to be planting short growing trees. So these are trees that are 25 feet and shorter, usually ornamental trees, because we don't want to have conflict with the overhead wires. And we'll show you some examples of what happens when, utility company unfortunately needs to come in and prune to protect their electrical wires. I want you to note too, we're not looking at the really thick black wires. Those are communication wires. They're not, they're not a concern. A tree probably will touch them at some point. It's not a big concern. What we care about are the wires at the very top. And it's hard to see in this picture, but there's 3 thin wires at the very top. That's your electrical wires. We want to avoid those. So our trees are going to be 25 feet maximum height. They're not going to get any bigger than that, and they'll never touch those wires. So we're avoiding that problem. A great example, and we mentioned this in the first presentation, is serviceberry, right? It's a small native flowering tree that gets no bigger than 25 feet maximum width. So that's also about 25 feet. And again, that's the maximum range that it can get. So it's not going to get bigger than that. It might not get to that height or width, but it won't get any bigger than that. It has beautiful white flowers. I love the fact that it has edible fruit, and it also has beautiful fall color with red or orange. This is what we're trying to avoid. So, when this tree was planted, either intentionally or unintentionally, nobody was thinking about the electrical wires or that it eventually would touch them. But these 3 wires at the top, they, it would cause a lot of damage if those branches get into those wires. We understand the utility company needs to protect that. So they're going to prune to protect their wires. And unfortunately, that's not the best thing for the tree. And it looks, it looks horrible. Okay. So now that I know where the overhead wires are, I'm going to start looking around. I want to see where the buildings are, where are the buildings so that I know how far away to plant. Are there any existing street trees along that block or that street? If a neighbor asks for a tree, but their neighbor has a really large tree next door, might not be the best location. That tree could shade our new street tree, or it might come in conflict with the roots. We want to know how much sunlight is getting in. Sometimes with row homes, the street becomes shaded all day. So I might need to choose a shade tolerant tree. And most importantly, where are water sources? Does a resident reasonably have access to water so they can take care of their tree and water it? This is also a concern for parks where water access might not be as easy. Lastly, I'm going to look down. And honestly, this is one of the most important steps. You want to know your soil. It's likely compacted being in a city location, but it also could be clay if you're down in South Jersey, or sandy. Up in North Jersey and Newark area, the soil is pretty rocky. So can a tree tolerate that? Can it have its roots take form and stand strong? We obviously don't plant in the road, but we need to know where the road is, the sidewalk, and the curb. When we create a tree pit, we always leave our curb. So I need to know, how many inches wide is that curb? And I need an 8-foot minimum for sidewalk. So when we cut out a tree pit, the smallest tree pit we make is 4 feet by 4 feet. We need to leave 4 feet of sidewalk remaining for ADA compliance. So I need to know, is there at least 8 feet that I can play with? Most important step is calling 811. We need to know where the utility lines are. So it's free, but it's also the law. So it's required. Calling 811, you see these markouts. You can see the yellow flags or spray paint, and that'll tell me, oh, there's a gas line. Don't put a tree pit here. There's a sewer line. I need to know where those are so I don't plant anywhere near them. A couple other things to know. It's useful to know if your tree is drought tolerant. This is especially true for parks where, watering might be limited, or it might be only with rain. So can your tree handle some periods without water? Your tree is adaptable to many soils. Again, city soil isn't always the best. So can it tolerate that soil and still thrive? Does your tree like full sun, partial sun, or shade? If I have a block that tends to get mostly shade, I shouldn't plant a tree that only can deal with full sun. It wouldn't do well. I talked about this in the first presentation, but is your tree hardy to the area? Checking the hardiness zones, making sure that it can withstand the coldest temperatures. Your tree is prone to pest problems. We just talked this morning a little bit about emerald ash borer. I don't want to plant a tree that is going to die from a pest in a couple of years. We can't predict everything, but we obviously won't plant ash trees. But there's other trees that can be prone to pests and problems. We don't want to give you a bigger problem. And does your tree have enough room to grow? I mentioned that our tree pits are 4 feet by 4 feet. That's usually good for our smaller and medium trees. But if I'm going to plant a larger tree, I want to make sure that that pit is big so that it can accommodate both the width of that trunk as it grows and also the roots, giving it space and not creating an issue where there might be some sidewalk conflict. Okay. If you've ever planted trees with us, either through Green Streets crew or through our volunteer programs, you're going to see at least 2 out of 3 of these trees. Trees come in 3 different ways. First one is balled and burlap. So you'll see this in the spring. You plant with us. These trees were planted directly in the ground, and then when they're shipped up to us, the nursery will just dig them right out. They do lose some of their root mass, and they wrap them in burlap. Most nurseries use wire cages. It's just easier. But some places like Fernbrook Nursery still traditionally drum lace their B&B trees. It's really beautiful. It's done by hand. And so if you see that, it's a special treat. These trees weigh up to about 500 pounds, so they're no joke. But with a little bit of physics, we're able to plant pretty easily. And so you'll see this in the spring. In the fall, there's some concerns with fall dig hazards. So some trees don't do well when they're dug out of the ground in colder temperatures. So we switch from B&Bs typically to containers. And so this tree has spent its time growing in a pot. Of course, root girdling is a concern. The roots are growing in a circle. So if you've ever been at one of our fall tree plantings, we will tell you to score the roots. cut through those roots, tell them to go outwards. We've talked about that previously. And so they tend to be a little smaller the day of the planting, but they'll still get to that maximum height and width. Lastly, there's bare roots. These are really young trees. Their roots are bare. They're super tiny. They're only like a few inches tall. Other organizations will plant these when they're trying to establish like a buffer, a tree buffer. But unfortunately, they do have a high mortality rate because they're so tiny. They can get mowed over pretty easily. They can be eaten by wildlife. So we don't plant these. It would be very silly to plant them in a tree pit. So we avoid them. You won't see bare roots when you work with us. Okay, so we have crafted a beautiful street tree project. We've worked with the residents. We've got all our trees. We've selected the appropriate species. The order is in, and it's the day of the planting. You are coming to work with us to plant trees, or you're a resident receiving a tree. The day has arrived. If you've ever come to one of our plantings, we're going to show you step by step the appropriate way to plant street trees. And so there's a few things that you need to know. First thing you want to do is dig a wide enough hole. You want to have room for your feet, especially true with our heavy B&B trees. I mentioned there's a little bit of physics involved, but you also need space. So when a tree gets into the tree pit, you want to make sure you have room to maneuver it, make sure that it's stand up straight. You want to check the depth. This is one of the most important things when you're planting a tree. You want to look for the root flare, and I'll show you a diagram at the end. It's where the base of the trunk, where your roots are starting to flare out. You want that to be level at or above the ground level. You do not want to plant that too deep. You don't want to cover up that root flare. You need it to be at or above the top part of your hole. Okay, for container trees, as we mentioned, you want to score those roots. They've spent their life growing in a pot, so you want to tell them to go outwards. Before the tree gets into the ground, remove all root material and tags. This is especially true for your B&Bs, which can be 10 feet or more the day of the planting. I'm only 5 feet, so I'm not going to be able to reach it. So you want to make sure you cut them off before they end up in the hole. Make sure your tree is straight. Container trees usually are pretty easy to keep straight, but B&Bs may need some support. So again, that's where your wide enough hole comes in, because you can jump in and maneuver it. And as I mentioned, at every planting, it's a full body workout. So you want to backfill that soil and stomp. It's not really compacting the soil. It's more like supporting the tree. The tree needs to adjust to its new location and start to regrow its roots. So you want to make sure that it's properly supported. So you're going to backfill that hole and stomp as you go to properly support that tree and make sure it stays straight.
We had a couple questions real quick. Bill just pointed out that one consideration in urban areas is contaminated soil. So lead, arsenic, petroleum, just make sure you wash your hands and clothes after planting. And then
you'll be dirty too, so good idea.
And then Judith wants to know, do you remove all material around roots, including the wire basket?
Yes, great question. So we didn't really talk about that, but yes, absolutely. It's very important if you have a wire bound B&B tree to cut that wire cage off and take it off. You want to make sure that you're giving that tree some space, and you also, that'll continue to constrain it. So you want to take off that wire. And we show you step by step how to do that. Usually what you'll do is you'll cut the base of the basket off. You'll roll the tree into the ground. And again, with your wide enough hole, you can get in there pretty easily and snip off the rest of that wire basket. We do keep the burlap in the hole. It's just easier, especially with a 500-pound tree. So you would just take that burlap and tuck it underneath the root ball. It's going to biodegrade and it won't harm the roots. So very good question. Thank you for pointing that out. Okay. So this is what your properly planted hole will look like. You note the root flare. Again, in case you hadn't seen that, it is the base of the trunk where the roots are starting to come out. And again, you want that. It's super important to have that level or slightly above the top part of your hole and your sidewalk, because you do not want that to be underground. You don't want that to be covered in soil. You're going to backfill and stomp the soil to support the tree, cradling it, making sure it's staying straight. Again, you take off the wire basket. Make sure that's taken off. And the burlap is tucked securely underneath the root ball. You want to backfill. You're going to place your soil around the root ball, but you're leaving that trunk completely clear and free of soil. And then you're going to add a 2 to 4 inch layer of organic mulch. We always provide mulch with our street tree plantings. So we're going to show you how that should look, but you want to lay that in a circle, a neat circle, not piling it on the trunk, and leaving it free and clear with the trunk completely open.
Judith had one more question. If the soil in the hole contains big rocks or a lot of rocks, should they be removed a bit and replaced with topsoil?
We don't typically provide topsoil with our street tree plantings. However, we do ask volunteers to take out boulders or rocks. Usually if there's enough soil to backfill appropriately. But yes, sometimes there's quite a bit of rock, especially if there's construction fill or something like that. So we ask to take out the bigger rocks. People will usually put them around the tree, so make a little circle around them. So yes. Okay.
And Kristen asked if we've started using biochar in our tree pits. We have not.
We really don't. I don't think I've ever used it in 3 years. So, but I mean, you know, occasionally we will have some stuff if we need to, like some nutrients if we have to provide it, but it's a very rare occurrence. And I've never used biochar.
Yeah, we use the mycorrhizae sometimes. Judith wants to know what biochar is. Krista might be able to explain that better than me because we don't use it.
Krista, if you wouldn't mind leaving that in the chat box, that would be awesome. So this is some examples of what not to do when planting. You know, again, if you look on the left here, this tree pit actually is an appropriate size. It looks like it's a pretty decent sized, but someone made the decision to cover up the tree pit with cemented in block. And there's such a little tiny space, it's ridiculous. That tree is not going to have room for its trunk, and it's going to uplift those blocks eventually. Just not a good scene. The one on the right is actually from Camden, and the pit is quite nice. The blocks are not cemented in; they're actually laid on top. But if you look closely, you'll see the tree's planted too deep. The roof layer is covered up with soil, and that's not good. That can cause rot. So it's going to trap moisture against the trunk. We don't want that. And it can introduce pests, pathogens, and fungi. So not a good scene. A few more examples of trees that are not appropriately planted. One in the corner here.
Oh, Meredith, your audio is weird.
Can everyone hear me?
Okay, now you're good.
Okay. Sorry about that. So this tree is planted in a corner, literally. It's confined by this fence. And, you know, it's being shaded by this tree on the top here. There's also bad staking. So it looks like it was staked at one point, but there's nothing to really support it right now. And it's going to be shaded out by this tree. And even if it's shade tolerant, it's eventually going to get into the leaves there. It's going to cause conflicts. The tree on the right, decent sized tree pit, but it's in an odd location. There's not really room for pedestrians to walk by. Also, it's just a really bad species. This is Callery pear. We mentioned this in the first presentation that, you know, highly invasive, not a good street tree. And look, it has a double leader, right? So not structurally sound. Looks like there's some sort of decay in the middle here too. So eventually there's a really good chance that one of these large trunks is going to fail. Okay, so as we mentioned and touched on a smidge in the beginning of the presentation, when we give free trees to residents, we ask that they care for that tree for the first 2 years of its life. So tree care after the tree planting event is essential for that tree to survive. There's a few tasks you need to do to support a young tree: water, weeding, mulching, pruning, and protecting. So we're going to go over each one and what that means. First thing, and probably most importantly, is water. Trees obviously need water to survive. So newly planted trees, and we plant, by the way, 2 to 2.5 inch caliper trees. So this is the width of the trunk. And so we plant between 2 to 2.5 inch, couple years old, better chance of survival. If you have a caliper or a width of that trunk, 2 to 2.5 inch, it needs about 20 to 25 gallons of water a week. Absolutely essential. If you have a heavy rainstorm, you don't need to water because that rain has already provided the water. But if not, then you absolutely need to. Water slowly and deeply from the base of your tree to the drip line. So again, you want to touch the roots. You don't want to be watering up here in the crown or along the trunk. You really want to water the ground so the roots can soak up the moisture. And you want to water slowly. You don't want to blast the tree with water. Just leave a hose against the roots for about 20 to 30 minutes at a slow trickle, and that will give you 20 to 25 gallons. Trees need about 10 gallons per 1 inch of caliper. So if you have a larger tree, 3-inch caliper tree, for example, it will need 30 gallons, 4-inch, 40 gallons. So either tack on or take off 10 gallons of water, depending on how many inches of caliper you have. Moisture meters are a great tool. They can help you determine if your tree is receiving enough water. We'll talk about overwatering, so you want to make sure you're not doing that just as much as making sure you're watering consistently. And if you want your life to be a little easier, irrigation bags are an easy way to water. So we'll sometimes provide them with tree plantings. They go on like a jacket. They zip right up against the trunk. All you do is fill the bag, and the watering bag will do the rest of the work. They hold about 20 gallons. They'll disperse the water slowly. There's also ones that are shaped like donuts for multi-stem trees. You just fill up that bag, or that looks like an inner tube, and it will do the rest of the work. Okay, so if your tree is not receiving enough water, it'll tell you. It'll give you some clues. First thing is that the soil is consistently dry. Older leaves will turn yellow and brown. They might also fall off. Dieback will occur. Leaves might wilt and curl as well. It's one of the biggest reasons an urban tree does not survive, especially with our B&Bs. Our B&B trees lose about 2/3 of their root mass when they're taken out and transplanted, and they need those 2 years to reestablish their root mass. So it's absolutely critical that they're getting support and they're getting a consistent amount of water. On the same token, you can actually drown a tree. You can get overzealous and overwater your tree. Some hints that a tree is being overwatered, very similar to underwatering. Your soil is consistently wet to the touch, so you're feeling oversaturated soil. Leaves are wilting even though the tree has plenty of water. Young leaves will begin to turn yellow or light green. All leaves are green yet brittle. New growth and shoots die off first. What happens is that tree roots need oxygen to function properly. Overwatering takes out the oxygen and it makes the roots die. And as we know, if the roots are dying, the tree's going to die. Too much water also attracts those pesky root rot organisms, so same thing. It's going to make the tree rot from the inside. Soil should be moist, right? It should be, have a moisture to it, but not be saturated. And it should have some time to dry out in between watering. Unfortunately, with the wacky weather, we've had a lot of rain this spring. Sometimes you can't control that if you're getting heavy rainstorms multiple times a week. But if you do see rain in the forecast, you're off for that week. You don't really need to water so long as you have a heavy rainstorm. Okay, some extra tips to efficiently water your tree. Do not lay plastics or impermeable liners in your tree pit. Again, that's kind of defeating the purpose of having a tree pit in the first place. You want the soil to absorb water, and you want the tree to have access for its roots. So that's going to take away that ability for the tree to absorb moisture. You want to water early in the morning to reduce evaporation, so it's not being soaked up by the sun. Create a basin or a barrier around your tree pit to reduce runoff. So you can put a little fence, and we'll show you some examples later on. That'll help keep the mulch in the tree pit, not getting washed away. It also keeps stuff from getting washed into the tree pit. Remove weeds from the base of your tree, and we'll talk about weeding in a little bit. Flowers are absolutely encouraged. They look great. And if you do have flowers in your tree pit, you can water a little extra so that the flowers also get moisture. but weeds are just garbage. They don't look good and they take away from the tree. If you have street trees, and this is only for your street trees, water 3 times as much one time, only once, to flush out all the road salt from your tree pit. Some trees can handle road salt more than others, but you just want to really flush out that tree pit, making sure that the salts don't stay in, and you only need to do it once.
We do have a question. What do you think is sufficient rainfall?
About a 1-inch rainstorm. So that would be about 20 gallons of water. Good question. Yeah, so like we don't want to have a drizzle, but a nice soaking rain is absolutely perfect. That's great for trees. And obviously a downpour, like a heavy rainstorm, you definitely don't need to water. All right, we're going to move on to weeding. Weeds compete with your tree for water and nutrients. So you want to make sure that those weeds are being taken out. They should be removed from the base of your tree by hand or using a garden hoe or hand trowel. So yeah, a little workout, but getting those weeds out of the tree pit is absolutely essential. They just make the pit look unkempt, but they also grow tall. They'll catch trash. And again, they're taking away those nutrients and water from the tree. We want the tree to get all those benefits, not the weeds. Instead of using an impermeable liner, lay down some newspaper in the spring. It'll help. It'll eventually biodegrade, but it will provide a natural way to keep those weeds out and allow the moisture to sink back into the ground. And you can easily cover it up with mulch so no one can see. Spraying weed killer is really bad for your tree and waterways. That runoff will carry the chemicals into the local river. We talked about in the last presentation, water pollution and runoff. So weed killer is certainly a contributor to that. So please, if you can, weed by hand.
And Kristen also pointed out when planting flowers, make sure you're planting ones with a smaller root system, because she had an example of someone planted mums with like a very big root system, and then the people ended up breaking the tree roots to try and plant them. So started out with small flowers.
Little tiny ones, the little ones you see in the store are perfect. And these are some examples of some very weedy tree pits. So you can see, trash is being collected that's unsanitary and even dangerous. You don't know what's in there. And it's taking away, again, nutrients and water from the tree. We want the tree to get all the benefits. We don't want the weeds to have them. Mulching. So please don't do this to your tree. It's not good for your tree. Mulch is absolutely essential. It'll help contain that moisture, reduce weed growth, actually improve soil quality, gives the soil a little bit of nutrients that breaks down, and it looks really nice and neat for your tree pit. But mulch should only be applied in a 3-inch layer surrounding your tree's root zone. You want to keep that trunk free and clear of mulch. You don't want to pile it onto your tree like a volcano. These volcanoes, just like the soil, just like planting a tree too deeply, trap that moisture against the trunk and can harm your tree over time. It increases the chances of getting rot. So you really do not want to do this. It's harmful to your tree and it looks ridiculous. You don't need half a foot of mulch piled against your tree. So please put it in a donut. Think donuts, do not think volcanoes. This is how a properly mulched tree should look. You're spreading that mulch in a nice circle, nice and neat around your tree. You're leaving a nice 2 to 3 inch diameter circle around the base. And you can add a water bag. This is what a good water bag should look like. You can easily fill it up, and you have that nice protective layer of mulch around the base of your tree. Okay, again, just to drive the point home, not having a huge pile of mulch at the base, having, again, a simple layer of mulch in a circle, and you can, again, still see that visible root flare. You want to make sure that's visible, and you want to make sure it's clear and free of any soil or mulch. Okay. This is how attractive a street tree can look when both residents take care of their trees. Note the cute little fence, again, that's keeping everything inside the tree pit, and the mulch is kept inside, it's not being washed away. If you've ever worked with us for a long time, Jess Franzini, we'll shout out to her. She was our former program director for UARP. And again, that mulch is in a nice, well, in this case, square, keeping that trunk free and clear. Okay, we're going to start moving a little bit into pruning. So one of the first things you want to look for is water sprouts and suckers. Water sprouts and suckers are kind of like weeds in that they take away from the rest of the tree. When a tree is under stress, it'll send out these little SOS signals, and that's your suckers. This growth should be absolutely removed immediately. You start to see this forming at the base of your trunk, cut it off. They are large, and they can get to be pretty large. Just like we talked about with topping trees, and we'll mention that again later on. These are not stable, so that they're not a normal formed branch, so you want to remove them right away. It's far easier to prevent suckers than it is to manage them. So again, when a tree is stressed out, it's going to start shooting out those SOS signals in the form of suckers. Prune them off once you see them. Don't over prune your tree though. Don't prune too much of the crown off. You don't want to remove more than a quarter of the tree's growth on top. But if you start to see these in the bottom, remove them, especially during the growing season. There's two tools you're going to need to properly prune your tree. You want to make sure that when you're making a pruning cut, it's calculated and done correctly. Improper pruning can absolutely damage your tree. Technically speaking, any pruning that you're doing is a wound. You're introducing a wound to your tree. So if done correctly, your tree will properly seal over. Trees do not seal, trees do not heal, they seal. So sealing over properly with a proper pruning cut is fine, but improper pruning can cause damage. There's two tools you're going to use if you're pruning your young tree. Bypass pruning shears for smaller branches and your handsaw for your larger ones. Okay. There's some things that can be done now, any time of year, and there's some things that are better left to the winter. In the winter, you want to look for your lower limbs, removing those, raising up the crown a little bit, and any sort of crossing and parallel limbs. So anything like that is structurally unsound, so you want to remove them, and they're better able to be seen in the winter when the leaves are off and the tree is dormant. It's also better for the health of the tree. Any time of year, though, you can remove dead, damaged, or diseased branches, anything that poses an immediate pedestrian hazard, and of course, those pesky sprouts and suckers. Please remember that a tree does use its leaves for food. Do not remove more than a quarter of the tree's growth. That will hurt the tree. Okay, this is probably one of the most important parts of the presentation. How to properly prune. So looking at this diagram here, using either your pruning shears or your handsaw, you want to feel for the branch collar. It's a raised circle around against the trunk of the tree. It's connecting the branch to the trunk. You want to feel for that. Some of them are more visible than others. You also want to look for the branch bark ridge, right? That's connecting the branch to the trunk. You want to leave both the branch bark ridge and the branch collar intact. So ideally, you want to cut right before that branch collar begins to form. You do not want to cut the branch collar off. That's considered flush cut pruning. And again, it can introduce a very serious wound to the tree. So you want to feel for that branch collar and cut right before it begins to form. And again, a proper pruning cut right before that branch collar, you're going to have a little tiny nub left behind. Your branch bark ridge will be intact, and the tree will be able to seal over that cut properly. Sometimes when you're pruning and you cut a large branch off, the weight of that branch, when it falls, it'll actually tear bark. That's not ideal. It'll leave another wound that the tree has to attempt to seal over. And sometimes it can be very severe and cause some damage. So when we have a larger branch, there's a 3-step pruning method to properly remove that branch without tearing bark. So I'm going to attempt to explain the 3-step pruning cut without actually being able to show you. So bear with me. So I'm going to try to explain this as clearly as possible. Totally understand if it doesn't make sense. If you need it to be repeated or re-explained, please let me know. So we're going to use the cedar tree as an example. We're going to be cutting this lower branch off. First thing you want to do, of course, is locate the branch collar. And you want to move a few inches up and away from the branch collar. We're actually not going to cut right at that branch collar for now. You're going to take your handsaw. You would not be using your bypass pruners for these. You're going to use your handsaw, flip it upside down, and cut halfway into the branch on the underside. So look real closely. You see that the saw is halfway on the underside of that branch. You're only going to cut halfway. This is creating a stop plug. It'll make a lot of sense in a minute. You want to move a few inches up after you've made your undercut and cut the branch off as you normally would, saw completely through, and just take that weight off. What's going to happen is there's a good chance, take that weight off. It's a heavy branch. The branch will fall and the bark will tear. It'll only go as far as that undercut. So you're creating a stop plug with that undercut, and the bark will tear only to where that undercut is. Okay, so you're preventing the tear from going any further. Once you've taken off the weight, you can remove the branch as normal at the branch collar. Okay, so at that point, all the weight's been taken off. It's not going to pose a risk, and you're not going to tear your bark. So you're going to have what's left behind is a nice pruning cut without any bark tear. Make sense? Good. Yeah. 3 steps, little extra. Sometimes it can be awkward cutting that underhand cut, but it really is worth it because you're protecting the integrity of that branch and you're removing that weight without tearing the bark. And this is why. Someone did not do the 3-step pruning cut here, and you can see that there was a significant bark tear. It was quite a large branch. So this is a very big wound. So you really want to try as best as you can to do that 3-step pruning method without, taking off the weight and not causing damage. Unfortunately, it's hard to show you on Zoom. I would love to be able to show you. If you have any questions about the 3-step cut, please feel free to email myself or Crystal, or we can talk about it at the end of the presentation. Absolutely, don't do this. Don't top your tree, destroying the shape of the tree. And of course, the bottom here, this tree was simply too big for this location, started to cause conflict with the electrical wires, and they had to prune for safety. You can also use bypass loppers to remove branches, but of course, keep in mind making sure you're cutting right before that branch collar is formed and removing that branch. Okay. Crown raising is simply taking off lower branches, raising the crown. This can be done for both safety and pedestrian hazard. So if it's an immediate risk, you can do it any time of year, but preferably during the winter when the tree is dormant. Again, if your tree has really low branches and it's posing an immediate safety risk, I'm pretty short, so it's tough for me to gauge that risk because branches usually go over my head. Excuse me. Sorry. But you want to take off any of these lower branches to protect people. Nobody should get poked in the eye walking past your tree. So that can be done any time of year if it's an immediate risk. But again, if not, you can wait till the winter. Conflicting branches should really be done in the winter when the tree is dormant. These can be structurally unsound. They're going to grow together, and when they become a big problem, it can fail when they are quite large. So you want to remove them when they're young and easy to remove. Again, when it's winter, all the leaves are off the tree, and you're still keeping that natural shape of the tree. You're not topping it. You're just taking off conflicting branches. This is a good example of a crossing and parallel limbed. You can see that this one has been left on for quite some time, and this one's starting to grow into the tree. So I would remove both of those branches in the winter and take that issue out now rather than waiting down the road when it can be a hazard. Pruning for aesthetics, pruning because you want it to look nice. Only done for cosmetic reasons and should only be done in the winter when your tree does not have leaves. Remember, every tree has a natural form. Choose a tree with a form that you want. Putting a tree into a shape like a lollipop is completely unnatural for the tree and honestly not recommended. It can weaken your tree.
We also had a question from Tom. Does it depend on what type of tree for crown raising? For example, don't you want to leave lower branches for pine, cedar, evergreens?
Typically, we don't plant evergreens for street trees. So if you're in a park, that's absolutely fine. We're thinking more of the street trees where it can be like poking people in the eye or something like that. So yes, good question. And as the pine grows, the canopy is going to raise. Typically that's in the park, so you don't really need to crown raise. Good question. As we've mentioned in previous presentations, don't top your tree. It's just bad for the tree. It destroys the natural form and shape of the tree, and it's not good for the well-being of the tree. And of course, that tree is going to send off those SOS signals. It's going to send off those root shoots, and it makes those really weak branches that are going to become hazards later on. So if you think you need to top your tree, please don't. Here's some natural forms of trees. So you can see the shape, and you can see actually where the canopy is. So someone mentioned evergreens, they're going to have lower branches. So just keep this in mind if you are selecting your tree, what that natural form is, and being willing to accept that natural form or choosing a form that you want. That way you don't have to change the shape later on. We're not a fan of lollipop trees or those spiral trees. It's not natural, and it's destroying that natural form. And again, I know I sound like a broken record, but please, please, please do not top your tree. Really, really bad for the tree and causes damage and those unsightly water sprouts. Okay, so you can prune now. Now is a good time to look at the health of your tree. There's 3 things you can do any time of year: your dead branches, damaged branches, or diseased branches. All of these are for the health of the tree. So they can be done any time of year when it's convenient for you. Like your aesthetics or shaping your tree, all cuts should be made at the branch collar, both with those larger branches, the 3-step pruning, or the smaller ones. And trees will, a proper pruning cut will allow the tree to seal over correctly. Also keep in mind, you want to remove the water sprouts or the suckers at the base of the trunk any time of year. Again, removing those sprouts. These are great actually when you're trying to practice pruning with bypass pruners. Super easy to snip off, and you can find the branch collar. And since they're low to the ground, they're real easy to practice on. But please remove them any time of year. They look awful, and also they're taken away from the rest of the tree. Clearly, this tree has multiple issues, but if this is your street tree, you can remove most of the issues any time of year. Remember all these water sprouts, you can take them off, the suckers, the dead branches, and I would honestly take off this one too. You can see it has a cracking here, some issues, so I would remove that for safety as well. And then in the winter, I would look for any conflicting branches or branches that are growing together. You can take those off at that point. But keep in mind, you don't want to take off more than 1/4 of the tree's canopy. You want to keep that intact so the tree can still continue to thrive and grow. Okay, some examples of what a good pruning cut will look like. Note the branch collar. Yeah, that little nub that's left behind, that branch collar is intact. You don't have any bark tearing, and the tree will eventually seal over properly. This is some examples of bad pruning cuts. I guess they were a little overcautious, trying not to cut into the branch collar, and they left this stub behind. Stubs are almost as bad as cutting too deeply into the tree or doing a flush cut pruning because the tree can't really seal over. It's just too much wood left behind. So you want to remove stubs. You don't want to leave too much wood hanging on. So I'm going to tell you a sad story. This is what happens when decisions are made without residents' consent, and unfortunately the trees suffer. This is one of our earlier street tree plantings in Camden on Clinton Street. It was May 2006. Typical street tree planting. Everybody was happy. They got their street trees. 2 years later, you have a horrible situation with sad top trees. Somebody, some I don't know, tree service had been hired to prune these trees for whatever reason. Trees were only 2 years old. Residents weren't aware of this. By the time they figured out what was happening, the damage had been done, and these trees were just destroyed. Absolutely unacceptable. I don't know all the details about this. It was before my time. These trees were replaced, but I mean, it's just a shame. Decisions were made. Residents were not really engaged, and unfortunately the trees suffered. But these trees were replaced. And again, when residents take onus of their trees, they can make the decisions about how to care for that tree. And yeah, I know this is really a shame. So not what we want to see. Okay, one of the last steps you want to take when you're caring for your tree is protecting it, making sure your tree, and you saw the horrible example in the last slide, protecting your tree, keeping it safe from harm. Please do not nail or staple into your tree's bark. If you have a sign you want to hang up, telephone pole, perfectly fine, but please do not destroy your tree. Lights and decorations on your tree are encouraged. We work with a nonprofit called Camden Lutheran Housing. We plant a lot of trees in North Camden, and so the Block Supporter Program from Camden Lutheran will give out Christmas lights, and the residents will put them in their trees. It's really pretty. However, we ask that after Christmas, remove them so the tree isn't growing into them. It's preventing injury to the tree. Do not let anybody carve into your tree bark or pull on tree branches. This includes children. Kids and tourists are pulling on branches. It'll create wounds. It'll damage your tree. And remember, your street tree is yours. If you want to put fencing around your tree pit or trunk guards, absolutely, totally fine. Just make sure that the trunk guards are accommodating the growth of the trunk, and that you're not raising up the soil and crowding it against the trunk. Also be vigilant. Trees have a mind of their own. They're going to grow with or without our help. So if you leave something on a tree too long, it can start to grow over it or around it. This does cause damage. It's also unsafe. If you ever have to take a tree down, this can be very unsafe for the person trying to remove the tree, especially something metal like this. But yeah, I mean, this is causing wounds, right? The tree is still growing around it, but it's not safe for the tree, and it's not safe for someone trying to manage the tree.
Bill also had a question about people who let dogs go to the bathroom around their tree. It's not great.
Not great. Not sanitary. I mean, it's not, my immediate thought is it's going to cause runoff pollution. The waste will go down the storm drain. And as we talked last presentation, that's going to cause issues for the waterways, more so than the tree itself. But yeah, I mean, a small fence will keep dogs from going into the tree pit. Hungrytrees.com. Great examples of trees that have a mind of their own and taking in, whatever that's left behind on them, on the trunk. I know it looks humorous. It's pretty cute, but honestly, it's damaging the tree. You see these open wounds, and again, unsafe for those trying to cut down a tree. And again, well-maintained tree pits look so sweet. They look great. These are all examples from Newark and Camden. Residents, again, you put little flowers in your tree pit. They look really sweet. And the mulch is protecting both the flowers and the tree. And the fences, again, are keeping everything inside. I think Bill mentioned dogs. So a little fence like this should hopefully keep dogs out. Some of them are a little bigger. And yeah, they look really nice. They add value to the block. They make the community look really sweet and nice. A couple other tips before we wrap up for today. I think someone mentioned earlier some, nutrients for the tree. We really don't recommend your traditional fertilizers. It's not tree food. It'll burn your tree's roots. We recommend compost if you want to add a little bit of nutrients. The mulch is also going to add nutrients, but if you want a little more, I would mix in some compost in the spring. If you really, really, really feel like you have to fertilize that tree, please wait at least a year post tree planting so the tree is a little bigger and can withstand that. Again, compost is great for your trees. Don't just add 100% compost. You want to mix it in with the existing soil. 50-50 is fine. Again, that's going to help. It's natural and it's going to add some nutrients to your soil. Soil compaction will happen over time, and it can make it difficult for the roots taking oxygen. So we recommend aerating the soil, using a hand rake to stir that top 3 to 4 inches of the soil once a year. So just mixing it up a little bit. will help to aerate the soil and prevent excessive compaction. Okay, we are going to talk real quick about fruit trees. I know with everyone being in quarantine, gardening has become very popular, and fruit trees are no exception to that. Camden's program does offer fruit trees for residents on occasion when we have funding. So we've given away fruit trees to residents without the traditional street tree project. More recently, we've been planting fruit trees in concentrated lots, making little orchards in Camden rather than giving them away. Like street trees, there's some care involved, so we're going to talk about that real quick. If you're considering adding a fruit tree to your home while you're social distancing. So again, there's some things that are very similar to a street tree care year round. One thing you can do all year is monitor for disease, making sure there's no weird changes or diseases being added to your street trees or your fruit trees. You want to weed and mulch pretty much all year except for winter. You also want to water 1 to 2 times a week, making sure that your tree is getting the water it needs to survive. Of course, if you have heavy rain that week, you don't need to water, don't want to overwater. In the spring, compost tea is basically compost in liquid form. So you can make it pretty easily, add some compost to some water, let it sit, and it's going to be easier to apply. So you can add that in the spring, give your tree a nutritional boost. In the summer, believe it or not, you do want to thin out fruit on your fruit tree, especially with the stone fruits like peaches. It can weigh down the branches and actually cause the branches to break because they're overloaded with fruit. So look for the best fruit, leave it behind so it can grow, and thin out the ones that just aren't up to par. And of course, harvesting both in the summer and the fall, enjoying the fruits of your labor, while of course continuing to water, monitor for disease and weeding. In the winter, that's when you can continue to monitor for disease and prune for shape. We're going to talk about 2 common fruit tree shapes. So that's when you want to really prune your tree and shape it.
Okay. Bill also pointed out that planting fruit trees as street trees, it will attract pollinators. Such as bees.
We don't recommend plant. This is for your backyard, urban gardening, things like that. We don't plant fruit trees on the street. So keep that in mind that this is more for your backyard gardens. Good point. So for 2 shapes that are common with fruit trees, for your apples, your pears, European plums, and cherries, it's going to look more like a traditional street tree. It's going to have a defined central leader and then alternating branches. So if you're pruning for the shape of your fruit tree, you want to space them about 4 to 6 inches apart. You want to keep more horizontal leaning branches than vertical. It's more structurally sound. It can bear more weight. Prune any of those co-dominant stems and any double leaders. So you only want one central leader in the tree. You don't want to have one that's competing on the side. Remove it as soon as you see it. It'll prevent weakening of the tree. So again, this is why we don't want central leaders. It's, again, a central leader. You want to have one main trunk that's growing straight. You don't want 2 of a similar width. Eventually, one of them is going to weaken and fall off. And it can be very serious when it's a large tree, both for fruit trees and street trees. So please make sure if you notice that you have a codominant stem or double leader, to remove that as soon as you see it so you don't have problems down the road. If you have Japanese plums and peaches, the shape of your tree is going to look a little different. It's going to be more of a vase shape without a central leader, and it's going to have about 3 to 5 scaffolding or alternating limbs. So make sure they're balanced and alternating equally, and you can shape that just as you would the other type of fruit trees in the winter. Okay, some extra tips for fruit trees to prevent disease and pest. You want to keep the area around your tree clean. I mean, this goes for both street trees and fruit trees, but you want it to be free of debris and litter so pests aren't attracted to it. Pick up any fallen leaves and fruit. Don't leave it rotting. That's going to be an incentive for pests to come to your fruit tree. Any time of year, you want to make sure you're vigilant and pruning to remove dead, diseased, or damaged branches. Taking them off is going to help the tree and hopefully prevent any spread of disease. If you do have pests, remove any diseased fruit that drops to prevent the spread of the disease to the other trees or just in general. And you can bag it up, throw it away. If you have diseased branches or fruit, I would not compost it. I would put it in a plastic bag and throw it away. Okay, so we're reaching the end of our presentation. Where we can open up the floor for a discussion. Real quick, I want to talk again about Target Circle program. This is a great way to support the Tree Foundation during this tough time. You can use your Target Circle app to make purchases and then vote for the Tree Foundation through your Circle app, and then Target will direct its giving to benefit us. If you want more information, target.com/circle. The focus areas this year are in Jersey City, Irvington, Bridgewater, Union. So please, you can temporarily change your target to be in that location so you can vote for us. And we appreciate all of your support. Real quick, if you have more questions, want to learn more, you can always go to njtrees.org, Best Care Tree Practices. We have everything that we've discussed today on our website. Any information, some good examples in our resources and education section. So you can also, why is my tree doing this? So if you have questions or you're noticing some weird stuff happening to your trees, take a look. We cover some of the more common issues affecting street trees. You might recognize a few of these. Pesky bagworm, in case you've ever seen that.
We also had a question from Val. Does the old rule of thumb about spacing street trees 40 feet apart still apply?
We don't always space them 40 feet apart, but it depends on the species. If you have a really big, if you're going to plant oaks on a street tree, I would space them 40 feet apart because they're going to get really big. But if you're planting like an Okami cherry, you don't need to. You can space them a little closer. I wouldn't put them right next to each other though. I would leave at least 15 feet apart to give it some room. Good question. And just a final reminder, you can apply both as shovel-ready projects in any New Jersey town, or if you're in Newark or Camden, you can apply to our volunteer programs. And again, please leave your name in the chat box to be counted for CEUs. If you have any questions about what you saw today, feel free to reach out to myself or Crystal. We're always here for you. We'll do our best to answer. We've had a lot of great questions today. I really appreciate the engagement. And that concludes TreeKeepers. Congratulations, everybody. You did a great job. Awesome questions. Thank you for sticking with us as we learned how to do this virtually. It was a learning experience for us. Definitely a bit of a challenge, but we really appreciate all of you coming out today. And we hope to see you in the future. Come out and volunteer with us. Come hang out. We'd love to see you in person.